I'm very happy to be here and welcome you for an interesting day and a half of discussions about the food system. I did want to put in a public service announcement about a recent report called Science Breakthroughs to Advance Food and Agriculture Research by 2030. So that must be a key. We'll all look for 2030. But it addresses, tries to identify the types of science breakthroughs, the types of innovations, where the barriers are, where the opportunities are. For many of the things that we're going to be talking about, looking at the food system in general, but where are those interventions? How might they alter the trade-offs? How might they change the direction? And I think when we talk about food systems, we're not talking about a static model. It's very dynamic, and it will reflect both changes in the environment as well as changes in the science and innovation. So I look forward to the discussions over the next day and a half. Our first speaker in this session focuses on the production, processing, packaging components, but there's going to be a lot of overlap in all the sessions. So we look forward to very integrative discussions, and please bring forth those topics throughout. First presenter is Becca Jablonski. She's assistant professor and food systems extension economist at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at Colorado State University. She's doing very interesting work on food systems and networks. She facilitates the Colorado Governor's Food System Advisory Council and is co-leader of Colorado State University's Food System Extension team. She's going to talk about spatial linkages, food systems linkage to rural economic development. Becca.
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here, and this is what a great event and a great panel we have in this session. Sorry, and I want to make sure I'm doing this right. What am I supposed to press here? Oh, got it. No. Okay, we're good. So by really any measure, we are seeing that there is changing consumer demand for lots of different kinds of products. This is, I think, something not new to this audience. And in addition to seeing that there's sort of changes in what people want to buy, right? For example, whoever would have thought, 15, 20 years ago that we'd see Burger King selling Impossible Burgers, right? And so in addition to that, we're also seeing changes in where people are shopping, right? How they're buying food. And especially, I think in thinking about how especially urban food dollars can be leveraged through procurement. And so Johns Hopkins has done a fantastic job for all of us in sort of tracking what these food policy councils are doing around the country. So here's the map that I just pulled off of their website about where these food policy councils are located in North America. According to their 2016 report, there were over 300 active food policy councils. And I actually had a student recently go through all of the websites of all of these food policy councils and look at which of these councils actually have a food plan, and then what are they saying in this food plan, and trying to do some of that analysis. And most of these food plans are pretty urban focused, right? Which makes sense. 80% of our population lives in urban areas. But many of them are dealing with issues around procurement, right? So this is what Johns Hopkins has put together in terms of looking at the types of issues that the food policy councils are dealing with. And if you focus in on where this green arrow is, this is really just some of the examples of the kinds of food procurement issues that these food policy councils are trying to leverage, right? And I think one of the big examples of this in terms of leveraging procurement is around farm to school. Of course, not all of the food policy councils have the ability to shape what the schools are purchasing, right? It depends on how the schools are set up. So when we work in Colorado, there's reciprocity between the procurement standards and the sort of bid process that the city sets and what the schools can buy, but they're not directly related. So we could talk about the details of that. But the idea here really is that we're trying to leverage the buying power of the National School Lunch Program, right? You're talking about a $13 billion program with over 100,000 schools across the United States, right? So that there's a lot of power here. And if you look at the bills that were proposed in 2017 and 2018, you can see that the majority of those that are focused on farm to school are really on this sort of local procurement aspect. And if you haven't seen it, the National Farm to School Network, I think, has done a really nice job in actually doing this state legislative survey on an annual basis. So I'm going to focus a little bit here on the Colorado context in Denver because I think it provides a pretty useful example of thinking about the extent to which the opportunities around leveraging procurement actually support linkages with entire regions, right? And thinking about then opportunities for both rural community economic development as well as to support farm and ranch profitability or at least viability. So Denver's mayor, Michael Hancock, signed this food vision in 2017. This was a pretty inclusive and comprehensive process, right? There was, I think, meaningful engagement with stakeholders and analysis of data. And they came up with these 4 pillars of things that they wanted to focus on, one of which is called the Vibrant pillar, which is really the one that focuses on economic development. And within that, they have these 2030 winnable goals. And I'll draw your attention here to the bottom bullet, which is that 25% of all food purchased by public institutions would come from Colorado. And that's pretty short order, right? We're talking about 2030 being the future. That's not too far away. So as part of this process, they started to actually look at, well, what do we know about what Denver is actually purchasing in general, and then what are they actually purchasing from Colorado grown, raised, processed sources so far? And they started to compile some of this data. Subsequently, actually, we've been able to leverage some resources through the Foundation for Food and Ag Research to actually hire somebody who's doing a more comprehensive process here to really understand what some of the potential spending is. But we know that there is some opportunity there. So what we hear through the, I would say, mostly urban food policy councils or some of these food policy councils is that if we leverage the procurement opportunity, farmers win and your community wins, right? This is something American Farmland Trust has put out, but this is what I hear a lot. And so we hear lots about this purported opportunity, but does the evidence really support that farmers, ranchers, and rural communities and economies benefit? And the first thing I just want to mention before I get into some of the research about what we know, we have very strong evidence that food systems development strategies involve rural-urban linkages. And I think sometimes this gets lost in conversations. So this is a picture of the state of Colorado, and it's showing you our population per square mile, right? Colorado is an interesting state, although not unlike some others, in that our population is very concentrated in a particular location, right? And if you look at the city and county of Denver, according to the 2017 Census of Agriculture, Denver County has 12 farms, right? None of which are over 100,000 in gross cash farm income, right? So even though we want to be inclusive of making sure these farms are at the table and in part of conversations, thinking about that Denver is going to feed itself is honestly just sort of silly, right? That's not what's going to happen. And just so that you know that I'm not just focused here on Colorado, right? The story is same in other parts of the country. Todd Schmidt and others at Cornell and I were involved in a project for several years with the New York City farmers markets, the Green Market Network. I think it's the largest network of farmers markets in the country, I think potentially even the world. They operate in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And if you look at where the farms and ranches are coming from that sell into those markets, right, they're really from the region, right, and mostly rural places, right, outside of the New York City metro area. So let's start with this farmers win and what we know, right? We have very clear evidence that consumers are willing to pay a premium for products with different types of attributes, one of which is a local or regional definition, right? And this is some work that's summarized in that Trends in Local and Regional Food Systems report that came out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service in 2015. So that's all well and good, right? But we also know that producers that are selling through these markets are going to have a different cost structure than farmers and ranchers that are selling through more traditional commodity markets. And so just understanding the willingness to pay isn't enough, right? We have to really understand expenses and therefore profitability by each of these market channels. So one of the things that we did on a case study basis in Colorado is to mimic something that was developed by folks at Cornell, led by Matt LaRue, to really do these market channel assessments and understand post-farm gate, right? So starting really with harvest. What are the differences, right? How are we utilizing labor and fuel, right, or transportation costs in particular, differently to access some of these different market channels? Importantly, they also added in two other pieces that are maybe potentially a little bit harder to quantify. They asked questions around risk and also lifestyle preference, right? Because say you can show that selling at the New York City farmers markets, right, at the green markets is going to be really profitable for your operation, but you're a farmer rancher who doesn't want to go and sell at a farmer's market or doesn't want to deal with sort of the hassle of finding someone to do it, then that's not a very good recommendation to make. And so I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I think the really important finding of this work is that we see that there is tremendous variation within these markets, right? So it's not like all local food markets perform equally. I'm just showing you here these marketing profit margin percentiles, right, for Colorado for just direct channels. I'm guessing people are familiar with this delineation between direct and intermediated, right? Direct is sales to farmers markets, intermediated is sales to schools or restaurants. So this, I'm just showing you the direct channel responses, but you can see here that for some of these channels like farmers markets or farm stands, we see incredible variation, right, between the top and bottom performers, whereas for a channel like a community supported agriculture arrangement, there's much more consistency. So in addition to some of this sort of case study work, we've also tried to leverage national data. So this is actually from an AFRI-funded project that was led by Dawn Thilmany, my colleague at Colorado State, where we use the Agricultural Resource Management Survey data. So this is the best farm financial data that we have nationally. As a quick side note, in case anybody who's listening or in the room has any power, all of the local foods questions were removed starting in 2018, and so we're really trying to get them reinstated. So just a plug there. So it is, it's a really useful data set though, because it allows us, right, we don't have to go and collect information, and there's really rich financial data that allows for comparison both within local markets, like across direct and intermediated markets, as well as comparison with conventional commodity producers. And so one of the things I want to highlight that we can see through research we've done, just focus here on those green bars. And if you look at the green bars, right, we're looking at scale. So these are farms and ranches that are selling through local food markets. And here we have on the far left, under $75,000 in gross cash farm income, 75 to 350, 350 to $1 million, over $1 million. What we see here, the story is the opposite of commodity-oriented agriculture, which is that as you get bigger, the share of your total expenses, your total variable expenses that are going to labor actually increases, right? And our hypothesis here is that really when you're selling through these kinds of markets, you're taking on more of these marketing, processing, distribution, and there's no shortcut in the labor piece, especially in terms of building these relationships, right? That's part of the reason that consumers are willing to pay that premium. And so understanding that story is important, and also thinking about potential implications for rural development, right? That if you're using more labor, there may be trade-offs between farm and ranch profitability potentially, but it may actually support jobs in more of these rural places. So we also divide this sample by quartile, and then we look at profitability implications by scale, right? We want to see if there's actually these trade-offs here. And so you can see for the third quartile that line sort of disappears. That's because those folks are essentially breaking even, so you really don't see them. But I think the really interesting takeaway here is that even for farms that are under $75,000 in gross cash farm income, we see that there are, a top performing quartile that have, really a great return on assets, right? So that there's some strategies that some of these producers are utilizing that make these market channels very effective. And then we do the same thing where we actually, instead of dividing by scale, we look at these direct to consumer versus intermediated markets, and then farms and ranches that are selling through both. And I think what you're really seeing here is that for the farms that are using just these intermediated channels, the return on assets for those bottom performers, right, are not quite as bad as for those who are using direct to consumer only channels. But we see that for those top performing quartiles, right, for those top performers, that they are looking really good. So lots more information here. We've put together some fact sheets, and we actually have a community of practice that we run with the USDA Ag Marketing Service. So if you go to localfoodeconomics.com, we've been trying to feature a lot more information there about this work. The last thing I want to say before I move on to thinking about some of these community impacts is that, in terms of the work that's been done in urban agriculture, and I think we're going to see more work done, especially with some of what we saw come out of the most recent Farm Bill. But at least the work that we see here, right, is that urban agriculture in general may have a number of benefits, right, in terms of educating consumers, right? It may teach people how to grow. They may have more of a connection to what they're growing and therefore want to eat more of it. But we don't necessarily see that urban farms are producing a profitable market channel, a profitable operation, or that they're really creating livelihoods on any sort of scale for the farmers and ranchers that are working on them, right? And so you can see here, this is from a study that was led by Carolyn Dimitri, where they did this 2012 national survey, and 26% of the farmers that they surveyed actually had a mission statement focused on markets. So that means 3/4 of the urban farms that they surveyed didn't even really think about sort of markets and some of these economic pieces, right? That the social mission is the driver. The other thing, and I'm sure Tricia can speak more to this, but I know the USDA Ag Marketing Service also put out a report on urban agriculture and really had some challenges in finding some of these really high-flying urban farms. So not that a few of them don't exist, but I'm not sure that it's sort of this beacon of viable livelihoods for the farmers and ranchers that are using them that we sometimes talk about. So your community wins, right? There have now been a host of these studies that have looked at the sort of short-term economic effects of these markets. I don't know how that happened. Okay. That have talked about the economic effects of these markets. In general, I think this body of literature shows positive but small effects, right? Some show no effects, but most of them show small but positive. But a few words of caution that I want to highlight, and these are provided in much more detail in this, the Economics of Local Food System Toolkit that the USDA Ag Marketing Service published a few years ago and was led by my colleague Don Thilmany. This was an effort that brought together a number of ag economists from across the country who are working in this space around local and regional food systems. The first thing is that there's finite resources, right? So that every decision involves a choice, exactly what Kate was saying about trade-offs, and we really want to think about that. We want to assess the net and not the gross effects, right? Many of the studies, I think, historically have really focused on those gross effects rather than net. And that thinking about those trade-offs can be on supply or demand side or both, right? And so we want to pay attention to both. So in thinking about the supply side, this is some work that Dave Swenson did a number of years ago now. But importantly, he talks about the fact that there's not just arable land that's sitting around in the Midwest not being used, right? Especially when commodity prices are high. And so if you're going to grow some more fruits and vegetables, you're taking land out of something that's already in production, right? That's already having a positive economic effect. And so we need to make sure we net those out. In terms of thinking about, how farmers are responding to these market opportunities, which I think is really critical and something that isn't often thought about, right? We have bills passed in Farm to School because if we increase local procurement, right, that's going to be a good. Well, we don't really do that work ahead of time to think about how are farmers going to respond to this, right? Is the new market increasing the price point? For Farm to School markets, the answer is probably no, right? Are we enabling producers to scale up? Now, what Farm to School markets may do is actually create a market for seconds, right? And so thinking about that is really important. Can the intended producer respond to the market opportunity, right? Do they have the right food safety protocols in place and the access to appropriate infrastructure? I remember I worked on a project one time where there was a lot of interest in doing more farm to school work with some local ranchers, but the challenge was that the processor that they were all using didn't have a metal detector. And of course, you need a metal detector in place at that processor if you want to sell to schools. And so thinking about some of those pieces is really important, right, if we're actually going to make local procurement work to meet the needs of farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. So, of course, most of this research is focused on these short-term effects, but I think evaluating the long-term impacts may be more difficult, but much more important in the long run, right? And so thinking about farmers markets as business incubators. So if we only think about what are the sales that take place at those markets, we may actually be underestimating what the results are, right? Are we actually generating new knowledge through creating more of these networks? Do people gain skills and business experience? And of course, there's literature to back most of these things up. Going back to the study that I mentioned that I worked on with my colleague Todd Schmidt when I was at Cornell and some others, one of the things we were trying to understand is that we know that at that green market, right, in the farmers markets in New York City, that there's an interaction that takes place, right? There's interactions that take place between farmers that are selling at those markets. There's interactions between the farmers and the market managers. And then there's interactions between farmers and customers at those markets, right? And of course, New York City is sort of the, it's sort of the extreme case. The Union Square Farmers Market on a Saturday in October gets 400,000 people to walk through there, right? So a little different than maybe some of our markets in Colorado and elsewhere in the country. But what we see is that when we actually did interviews with farmers that were selling there, and then we also did surveys with customers who were purchasing product, we found that 75% of the farms made or intend to make changes to their farm business based on ideas they got from those interactions. 45% of the farms made changes to products sold in both rural and urban markets, so you're not just seeing that urban effect. And then 82% reported they shared those ideas in rural places, right? And so thinking about the role of that kind of transmission of knowledge and ideas, I think is really important. Now those rural places need to have the infrastructure in place, right? In fact, I can think of a producer that I worked with who actually moved to a different county because he had the ability to work with an independent dairy processor who was going to co-pack a product for him, right? And he had learned about that idea through some interactions with the market. We also see, and this is based on correlation, not causation, so I really want to highlight that, but that when we look at, we created this human capital index for the northeastern U.S., and we see that the stocks of human capital are significantly higher in counties with green market farmers, right? No, we need to do a lot more work to tease that out, but I think it's an interesting thing to note. And I've tried to include all of the citations here so you can see where everything's published. So moving forward, right, if we're going to leverage procurement opportunities, do we have the right people at the table? And we do a lot of work with the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council, and they have done a wonderful job in setting up that council to make sure that they're inclusive of the people of Denver, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're inclusive of the farmers and ranchers or ag businesses that are actually going to be growing, raising, and processing the food. And so the Sustainable Food Policy Council is actually going and setting forth standards about the Denver procurement policy. And what they've been doing so far is defining these as the good food purchasing standards, right? And so I'm guessing most of you in the room are aware of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. This is the only effort that I know of that's sort of national and looking at setting these institutional procurement standards. I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to go really very quickly through this end part here. But these are the 5 areas in which they're really looking at some of these standards. I think that there's probably notably, especially from Denver's perspective, things like racial and gender equity that are missing from this that we've talked a little bit about. And then also, because these standards are based on existing third-party verification programs, they may ignore some of the heterogeneity that exists in particular contexts. So one of the things we've heard from, for example, Megan Shapansky, who Kate cited earlier, is that there's significant trade-offs between organic certification and the ability to practice no-till in a dryland wheat production system, right? And so thinking about, do these standards actually work in different regional contexts, I think is really important. And what we've been trying to do in Colorado is actually to bring together producers of scale and from diverse commodities in conversations with some of these urban stakeholders to really think about how do we make sure that leveraging procurement is going to work for everybody, right? Meet those urban goals as well as those of farmers and ranchers. And so we've been holding producer meetings and doing these different scenario analyses. So asking, based on the Good Food Purchasing Program, can you actually meet the standard now, or could you meet it in 5 years, and what type of premium would you need? Is the infrastructure actually available to do these kinds of things? And we're going to be holding a statewide food summit to actually tease more of these pieces out. And I think the thing I'm most proud of about this work is if you look at the list of partners, I don't think that the partners that are at the table are the normal people who would sit at the table, right? They're from the health advocacy organizations, they're from our traditional commodity groups, they're from our urban partners as well. And so we're really excited. So just to end here, are you creating markets that are going to work for the scale, commodity, et cetera, of the producer at the table, right? And the different business models are going to work for different types of producers based on competitive advantage. Is the right infrastructure in place? We really want to think about leveraging underutilized assets before we make new investments. And I don't think we're doing this very effectively right now in the food system work across the country. And the heterogeneity of products and processing systems makes things complex, right? We've been trying to deal with thinking about traceability of wheat, for example, and that is a very, very difficult thing. And so we really want to think about these things before we just go ahead and say local procurement is really going to be the answer. So thank you very much.